Well, hey, it's Rob, and over the last couple of weeks, I've gone down the proverbial rabbit hole regarding the Gibson Moderne, Gibson's long lost solid body guitar. Apparently, I wasn't alone because today I'm going to show you a Zoom call that I'm about to do, and this includes such luminary figures in the world of guitar. Hopefully, we'll see if they sign on, but I think so. As Dan Erlewine, who is pretty much the master of guitar repair. He literally wrote the book on it. And at least one representative from George Gruhn's guitar shop in Nashville. I think someone who previously worked there, who had experience with this specific Gibson Moderne, the black solid body guitar that is pretty much the only example ever even suspected of being a legitimate prototype of that guitar. We may get George Gruhn himself to come on, not sure. And got a few other people who have Facebook pages. Possibly I'm going to get Ronald Wood, the author of the book about the Moderne, to come on. We're going to have like a summit about the Gibson Moderne over Zoom in just a few minutes. And again, not 100% sure who's going to show up, but I think we're going to certainly learn some things that we didn't know before. And I may even get a person who claims that his friend Jack actually owned this guitar before it ended up in the hands of Dan Erlewine. So we'll get some of the prehistory of this black Gibson Moderne that we didn't know before. Possibly. Who knows? So stay tuned. I'm going to cut right into it now and probably say a few of the same things that I just said now again over Zoom. But anyway, this proves to be an epic discussion on what is pretty much considered the holy grail of solid body electric guitar. So let's... All right, hey, so I'm Rob Disner. I'm an audio engineer and pretty much a lifelong guitar player. I grew up in Detroit. This is kind of a Michigan story, at least part of it. I'm in Atlanta now, but anyway, I went down the rabbit hole on this Gibson Moderne story over the last couple of weeks. Dan Erlewine is coming into the room right now. We're gonna let him in. And all right, I'll have to stop and say hey to Dan. So hang on a sec. Back to our gallery view as he's popping in. Anyway, I'll continue on. We're going to let the experts take over in a second. I'm certainly not an expert, and I never saw this guitar, but we have people on this call who actually have. I mean, Dan Erlewine wrote the book on guitar repair. There he is. I see him. So how'd he do?
Howdy, can you hear me?
I hear you, Dan. Thank you so much for coming in. I was just saying you wrote the book on guitar repair, and I actually even own the book, so I've had it for decades. But I'm just going to talk about who we've got in the room here, why we're here, and then let you guys have it. So we've got Mike Moffitt, who worked for Gruhn Guitar, I believe, at the time, and actually tore apart this guitar that both Dan and Mike had seen. And we're going to talk about what they thought about it, what it was, what they saw, all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if George is coming on himself. Of course, George Gruhn owns pretty much the best guitar store on the planet, Gruhn Guitars in Nashville, and he's pretty much the expert, or one of the experts on vintage guitars. Anyway, my story very quickly. I started playing guitar at a store called Rock City Music in Detroit, in Royal Oak, Michigan on Woodward Avenue. And my guitar teacher had a 1958 Flying V. He bought it from like a trade show or something. He paid $1,500 for it. He was holding his head because it was so much money back then. Couldn't believe that he spent $1,500 on a guitar. But of course, who knows what a 58 Flying V is worth now. But I've always wondered about that guitar and what happened to it over the years. It got me interested in the modernistic series of guitars, these three guitars that Gibson made with the crazy designs back in the late 50s. And so we started searching around. There was just a random Facebook post from 5 years ago that I actually missed. And 5 years later, I reached out to a friend of John's who we have here. And John confirmed that he thinks he knows who owned the Moderne before it got to Dan. It's supposedly a guy named Jack who owned the guitar. He's the one who took it to Gibson, had the neck replaced, and all the stuff that happened to it. And so I'm just going to try to go in kind of chronological order to talk about who owned the guitar, who had it next, who sold it where, what happened to it, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to zip through it right now. Let's hear from John, who's a person I think that a lot of you, of course, don't know and don't know his story. And let's hear his story and see if it kind of makes any sense in the general context. I reached out to this guy, Jack, who's supposed to own the guitar. I just left a message. I haven't heard from him. But John, if you just want to share your story about what you call the Monster V, just to get us started off.
Okay, guys, can you hear me? Yeah. I went to high school with Jack. We split up. He went to college at Western Michigan in Kalamazoo. And then we both kind of washed out of college, and we were in bands together starting around 70. But Jack, he had this project he found, and it was, back then, he told me he found it in a dumpster behind Gibson on Parsons Street. Just telling you what he told me. I can't do any of this fact checking or believing it's fake or anything. So anyway, Jack took the guitar and he went back to Gibson and he had him. The guitar was broken. It was, the headstock was broken off. There was only like 2 of the tuning holes through it and the rest of it was missing. I don't really recall if it had paint on it at that time, but I think it had a stamp on the back by the volute where it would say factory second, some kind of pressed image onto it. Well, anyway, Jack sent it back to Gibson. He had them painted black. There was no pickups on it or anything. It was just one step above a piece of driftwood. And he had them put on a unbound rosewood neck with the normal asymmetrical peg head, not that Gumby thing. And I do recall it had like Kluson Perloid tuners on it too. So Jack was a guy who went through a lot of guitars, and he told me he traded it for a Martin D18. And that was pretty much the end of the story. I didn't see Jack much after 75 till about 2002. I searched him out in Colorado where he lives, and I spoke to him once about 4 years ago. And I try not to bring up this topic with him because I think he would be pissed if you know, he knew his guitar was worth $600,000 or something like that. But I can tell you I'm speaking from the heart here, and I've had one other friend already confirm this with Rob, and I've got a third guy that knows Jack's guitar, and I don't know what I can add to it beyond that. But he took it to Gibson. They refinished it, put a neck on it, fretboard, story. It's about all I can tell you.
All right. Well,
glad to listen to all you experts.
Like I said, I mean, this was a post from 5 years ago that I just happened to randomly see, and I thought that's kind of interesting because I've never heard anything about the story of this guitar before Dan Erlewine got a hold of it. So if we can, let's get Dan on and have him tell his story once the person who we are assuming to be Jack, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, sold it to Dan.
Same story I've told many times. Ann Arbor, Michigan, outside on Ellsworth Road, where I had my shop. Actually in Ypsilanti Township, that kid brought by that guitar and wanted to sell it. And I heard from him, or I don't know who he was, that it came from Gibson or out of a dumpster, or somebody's dad worked there. And somebody didn't like the shape of the neck, so they sent it to a guy that worked at Gibson to put a melody maker on it. And I bought it for $175, thinking I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe this was an Explorer. I never heard of the word Moderne at that point. I knew Flying V. Took off the pick guard and there was a bunch of holes in it, routed in there right down to bare wood. Nothing professional about it. I freaked out and figured I bought a lemon. I filled those holes with plaster of Paris. I have to laugh about that. That's before I would have considered. I didn't have the tools to use a mill and put wood in it. I did it immediately, filled it with plaster Paris. When it dried, sanded it, sprayed it black, and took it down to Ann Arbor Music Mart and sold it. And I got my $175 back. And then Doug Green, who used to work at Herb David's store in Ann Arbor when I did, was now working for George Gruhn. He was back in town visiting, walked by Music Mart, saw it, called George. George said, buy it. They paid $1,000 for it. And I guess George was really pissed when he got back with it. And I haven't seen it since. I've seen pictures of it in magazines. And that's it. I mean, you can read that. It's been in some magazine. It's been somewhere. I know that. Could have been Guitar World or Guitar. I don't remember, but I remember seeing it in a magazine. Same story. And then once somebody was writing a book on the Moderne, and they brought the Moderne to my house here in Athens. Eric Coleman was there, and he brought the guitar with him. It was a fake Moderne, and he was trying to put it off on us and have us verify that it was original. And they even spent money to have some experts flown in besides Eric and me, Phil Jones from Gibson and Tom Murphy. And it was not real. And I think the guy got pissed. I don't have any photos of it because Eric said this morning that he didn't think the guy would let us take photos.
What year was this? Are you talking about when this originally came to you or later on?
No, this is
a different one.
Eric knows.
This
What
was a
year,
different
Eric?
one.
Totally different guitar, not the one in Tokyo.
No,
Yeah,
this
this is a different one. Yeah, this guy brought one over in 2005. Same pickguard kind of layout and all that kind of thing. This one was really weird. It had all metric fittings, so it was probably Japanese in origin or something. But yeah, not the same as the black guitar, but it was another.
To be a real
hippie
one.
Yeah, that person claimed it was real.
Gotcha. I mean, what's funny is that Ibanez copied the only one that's around, which is the one John is talking about that's been hanging in the store in Tokyo. And most people think it's not even real, but it didn't matter to them. They copied it anyway. And now everyone's copying the copy and saying that, they've got a real one.
Ibanez copied that black one?
Yes.
With the Melody Maker peg head?
That's the one. Yep. If you look at the Ibanez copy, it's got the standard Gibson peg head and that crazy pick guard with the unusual design that's not in any of the drawings, that wouldn't have come from Gibson or anything like that. And that's what they copied. That's what Billy Gibbons also has. And for years he claimed that his was original. And then I think he stopped talking about it because I think he figured out that what he has is just an Ibanez copy. Maybe that someone, put Gibson on the headstock or something like that. But
Dan made that pick guard in order to cover up all the holes.
Okay, so that's what we were wondering. So Dan actually made that pick guard because of all the stuff going on there, because it's also routed in the back, and it seems so strange. Why is there a route in the back and it's a pick guard on the front? So do you remember, was it routed in the back? Did it look like it had a standard cover?
Remember. I do not remember it was routed in the back. It wasn't in the shop very long. Yeah,
because I've seen pictures and it definitely looks like there are screws back there, but it doesn't look like any of the reissues or anything like that. Not that that means anything, but it sure looks like it was routed in the back for controls, and it had that huge cover on the front covering up all the other stuff on there. So that was actually your design for that pick guard, and that's what got copied by Ibanez with the little swirl and everything on it. Just covering up whatever was there.
So you're talking 50 years ago.
Oh, I know. It's amazing we can even be here and talk about any of it at all. But if that's the case, they liked your design so much that they copied it. So
that's hilarious.
Yeah. You can just search for Ibanez. I think the Ibanez was called the Ibanez Futura. So if you search for Ibanez Futura, you will see a Moderne with your pickguard on it.
They still make them?
No, they copied them in 1975. and they did the whole series. They did the V, they did the Explorer, and they did the Moderne based on the one black Moderne that John is talking about that was hanging in a store in Tokyo, and they saw it there or borrowed it or whatever, and they knocked it off. So they're very rare. I mean, even the copies are really hard to find, but you can see the literature and the ads and all that kind of stuff. And that's for years what everyone said is that pickguard doesn't look like a pickguard Gibson would make. So if it's true that Dan made it, then we know that at least that's true. Gibson didn't make it, you made it.
Yeah, I don't even remember if it had a pickguard on it when it came in.
Yeah.
If it didn't, I would have made a pickguard to cover up the plaster of Paris. I've never heard anyone mention the plaster of Paris.
Right.
All
Well,
the stuff I have read, have you ever heard that it had plaster of Paris filling?
because nobody's looked inside that thing in 40 years, to my knowledge. Once it went to Tokyo, it went over there and that was it. But well, let's jump to Mike, because of course Mike saw the guitar after you did when it went over to Gruhn, and maybe Mike can tell us what he saw and what he thought.
Yeah, a little background here. I started in the mid '60s playing and dealing with instruments. In '69, I bought my first Gibson Explorer. It was advertised in a Miami newspaper, classified ad as a Gibson Exploder. So I went down to see what it was. It was a Gibson that I had never seen before, so I bought it for $150. He just misread the what was written on the bill of sale when he got it. George Gruhn hired me to work at GTR. I'd done a lot of business with him. Hired me to work there in '73 because he was planning a trip to Japan. He wanted somebody to run his store for him that was knowledgeable about instruments, and so he hired me to do it. By then, I had owned 3 original Explorers and more Vs than that, and a little bit of everything. At GTR, I was out one day, and Doug came back and brought the guitar.
God, sorry, I never paid you for the last time. It's not okay.
It's okay. I texted Joan.
Hang on. All right, we've got him muted. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so I came back into the shop from lunch, and Doug had just returned and brought the guitar with him. Other than the neck, which was a Gibson neck, nothing on the guitar looked like a Gibson product. We took it apart. It was a mess inside. There wasn't any professional routing at all, which I'd never seen on a Gibson produced instrument. A lot of it looked like it might have been pressed in or carved out with a spoon, like the plaster of Paris that we're talking about, I think. And the routing, the wood was just gouged out. It didn't seem to even be routed by a router.
Do you know what kind of wood it was? Did it seem like it was Carino, poplar, something?
No, it was a soft wood, like pine. It was something that Gibson wouldn't have made a solid body guitar out of. Anyway, George hired me because I knew guitars in general. I knew electrics better than anybody he knew. So we looked at it, and George put it in a trash can in the store, and I think called wherever he got it from, wanting his money back. Doug didn't pay $1,000. He paid more in the range of $350 at the time. Back then, $1,000 would have bought you a Sunburst Les Paul. That was a good piece of change. but it was a few.
You could get a used Ferrari for $1,000 back then.
Yeah, no, it was a few $100 that George sure wanted back, and I don't know who he called. I was out of the loop.
What do you think?
For all just the money reasons, but he called somebody and got some money back, I believe, from whoever he bought it from, whoever Doug bought it from.
Right, that's the Ann Arbor Music Mart,
Oh,
which
boy.
is a store that was still there when I lived in Ann Arbor in the 80s. And I think I bought my snakeskin covered Fender Twin from them. So they were around for a long time.
That sounds nice. Anyway, that's where it went back to. It sat in the GTR wastebasket until then. There was no need, as far as any of us was concerned, to take photos of it. Back then, a Polaroid, they were about $1 a piece just to take a Polaroid, and the only other option was using film and a camera, which, why waste some money on something we were just sending back anyway.
Right.
It was a Gibson neck. That's about as far as it went as far as a Gibson product.
So I wonder, once it went back to Ann Arbor, how it got to Tokyo. Who convinced someone in Tokyo that this was a good purchase? And I'm sure they spent a lot of money on it to get it out there.
See, one the main reason George hired me in '73 is he had planned a 6-week trip to Japan. He was getting contracts where he was getting mandolins and some guitars built in Japan for him. So he wanted somebody to run the store while he was gone. That was my job. So that's about where we were. George was making contacts in Japan, and the Japanese were buying a lot of instruments. They were just starting to buy, as far as I was concerned, vintage instruments. And they were a market, and it wasn't any surprise. I mean, when we heard that guitar went to Japan, we just figured that, somebody got a fish on the hook and sold it to him in Japan. So that's the last I heard of it. I've seen pictures pop up here and there, but it's starting to sound a lot like, it was Ben Franklin's hammer or axe, where he only replaced the head and the handle. Everything else was original.
Right.
We got a neck replaced, that wasn't the original neck, and a body that I just don't think there's any way in the world that was a Gibson product. And heaven knows where the pickups came from. I don't.
I mean, the interesting thing about the story that I see is that if it was really taken back to Gibson to have the neck replaced, why would they replace the neck on something that clearly wasn't a Gibson product? Wouldn't they have just said, what is this piece of junk? This is not something we made, get out of here. So that, and nobody can answer that, but
my answer is, I can answer it, and I would bet that Gibson didn't put the neck on there. Someone else did.
Yeah.
The guitar that the neck came off wasn't an expensive guitar, and someone, if they were going to put a guitar together, that would have been a good choice of a neck.
Gotcha. Hey, George, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
George, thank you so much.
About this until just a couple of minutes ago.
I know. I'm amazed that I got you and Dan to come on this call. Although
I don't recall anything
Dan.
about any original Moderne. There was one that Doug Green, who was working for me at the time, found, and I think it may have been up in Michigan, and it was
that's the one we're talking about.
It's crap. It wasn't the Gibson. I have nothing further to say about it. It's not it wasn't real.
Yeah. So
George, George, Mike Moffitt here, buddy. How's it going?
I'm doing fine. But yeah, Doug showed up with that thing, and I looked at that, and from 10 feet away, I could see it was fake. And I don't have anything further to say about it.
Even the neck you think was fake, or it was a real Gibson neck on a fake body?
It's been many years ago.
Yeah.
I think it might have been a Gibson neck stuck on some homemade body, but it was certainly not a real Moderne.
Right.
It was so bad and crude, it was laughable.
And to your knowledge, there's never been a Moderne that surfaced that has been verified?
I've never seen one.
Yeah. Do you think they even made them, even prototypes, or?
I can't tell you if they made a prototype or not, but to the best of my knowledge, the only evidence of a Moderne is that ridiculous little tiny drawing. And that's it. Nobody's shown up with a Moderne guitar. Now, I've heard stories, I think rather apocryphal, about some Moderne that was in a hock shop in Indianapolis, but I never saw it. And I was in that same hock shop and saw a bunch of good stuff and bought some, but I didn't see any Moderne. And if it was the one that Doug Green found up in Michigan, I have nothing further to say about it. It's a waste of time to even discuss it.
George,
Well, and that's what they said you'd say.
George, Mike here. Do you remember where we put the guitar while we waited for it to get sent back?
No, I don't remember. I just remember that it was garbage.
So what's where you put it? You put it in the garbage can. That's where it sat until you got your money back.
Well, I don't think I have anything further to say about it. So you
Well,
guys
we
can debate it all you want, but you know, some people want to debate at great length about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but I don't believe in angels. And therefore, if I don't believe in angels, it's irrelevant how many can dance on the head of a pin, because they don't, as far as I'm concerned, nobody's proven that they exist. And so far as I'm concerned, nobody's shown an original explorer yet. And there are people who've offered as much as $1 million for one, and it hasn't prompted one to turn up. Now, Billy Gibbons claims to have had one or still have one, but he won't show it to you. And
well, we
anybody
suspect
would have one and would probably at least provide a picture if he had it, would be Dirk Ziff, and I don't think he claims to have one.
Right. We're pretty sure that Billy Gibbons is a copy that was made by Ibanez, and maybe someone put a Gibson headstock on it, and it's pretty much a copy again of the pick guard that Dan Erlewine just told us he put on this thing to cover up all the routing holes. So everyone's been copying what Dan did for years.
Well, the best Billy Gibbons story I have, it's not about the Moderne, but about an explorer. And that is at least 30 plus years ago, I was talking to Billy, and he said that he did a show once, and he played on Pearly Gates, the Les Paul, for the show. And then when it came time for the encore, he played his Explorer. It was a 58 model. And after the show, a guy came, he was backstage, and said, "Hey, Billy, that was a really neat guitar you had." At the end for the encore, that was that an Ibanez or was it a Hamer? And Billy said, "No, that was my original 58 Explorer." And he said, the guy looked puzzled and said, "Gee, I didn't know they made them too."
It's true. The copies get more famous than the originals. I think Ibanez made more Modernes, I'm sure they did, than Gibson ever did, even if they really did make some. And they just copied the one that you saw.
My point is that even 30 plus years ago, this may have been 35 years ago, he told me this story. The Explorer shape was so rare from Gibson that when people saw one, they were familiar with Ibanez and familiar with Hamer, but many people didn't know that Gibson made them at all,
right?
Let alone being first.
Well, hey, they made 20 copies in the 50s, so you know.
Well, anyway, I don't have anything else to say about it, so I'll sign off.
Well, we appreciate your time, and it's very good to see you.
But I do vividly remember the guitar. It was laughably bad.
Well, we've got a guy up here who thinks that his friend owned it first. And I'm not saying his friend was the guy that made it or copied it or whatever, but his friend sure believed it was real, and you know, sold it on to Dan Erlewine, who then
now his friend may have claimed that,
Oh yeah.
And Dan Erlewine should know enough to know a Gibson when he sees it and to know that one. If he couldn't look at that and not instantaneously know that it was fake, then something's seriously wrong. He knows better. And that was not a good enough copy to fool anybody who knows about guitars. The
Right.
workmanship
We're just
was-
trying to figure out where it came from to begin with, because
Who
in
gives a
1970
shit? What difference does it make?
well, just that in 1970 nobody even knew what it was to copy it. There were no examples out there. So who even knew what one looked like to make a copy?
There were patent drawings since 1958, guys.
Right.
There
Right.
was
But
drawings, yeah.
yeah, how many people get to see drawings? You know, I mean,
Yeah,
somebody
some-
had some connection to Gibson, maybe.
Well,
They look in-
somebody saw a drawing and copied it, but Gibson didn't make that guitar. I'm not saying Gibson never made a prototype, but that wasn't a prototype made by Gibson. The workmanship on it was ridiculously bad.
Well, we can't argue with the people that have seen it, and that's certainly the consensus of Mike and George and Dan too, that whatever they saw was not a real Gibson. But if it had an original Moderne neck on it that was replaced, maybe it was half of a Gibson when it started. Who knows? It's hard to say. So lots of stories.
Well, I don't even recall it having a peg head that looked like a Moderne.
Right. The story behind it is that the person who had it didn't like the Moderne headstock, or it was damaged, and he took it back to Gibson, who then replaced it with a contemporary,
That's
melt.
bullshit.
It's just a story.
Gibson would not have worked on that. I mean, you're just getting into speculation. The guitar is garbage. Gibson did not work on that guitar. They would not have worked on it if you had taken it to them.
Right, and that's what I wondered. Why would they if it was clearly fake?
Well, they wouldn't,
Yeah,
and they didn't.
That's backstory somebody created.
Yeah, just because somebody tells you that they saw a dinosaur in the Congo, that don't make it so. And there's a lot of sightings of the Loch Ness monster and sea serpents and hoop snakes, and there's a whole lot of things that people believe and
Well-
perpetuate.
Well, we've got a guy right up here, John. And John, you can confirm you actually saw this black guitar, right? We can go that far.
Yes, absolutely. I've seen it, and I've like the other guys we were in the band with, they'll all tell you the same story.
And that the story you heard was that he had the neck replaced because it was damaged.
It wasn't the neck, not like the heel of the neck, but a whole new fretboard and a new peg head, because the peg head was broken off above like the first and the sixth string. There was only like 2 holes in there, and then the whole top piece was gone.
Well, the
And that-
body was crude. The body was ridiculously crude. It was also smaller than the modern copies that Gibson made later. So it was a different size. It was not the exact shape, and the workmanship was ridiculously crude. Anyway, I have nothing further to say. Bye-bye.
Thanks, George. All right, John, you got anything to say? Any questions for anyone that's here?
Yes. I got an email from Ren Wall this morning. I got a hold of him last week through a friend. And this is the email I got.
Why don't you explain who he is, just so people watching this will know?
Well, Ren worked at Gibson. His father worked at Gibson. And the email he says is, sorry, I don't remember Ralph Cole. Now, Ralph is the guy whose girlfriend drew a picture of him playing what looks like a Moderne.
Well, actually, John can clear that up. Whose girlfriend drew that picture? Or girl?
She was just a neighbor girl. She wasn't specifically
friend.
anybody's girlfriend, but
Okay.
a neighbor girl.
Right.
And and the,
And what-
the 1 second, the Ralph Cole part of the story, I didn't hear until like 4 or 5 years ago. Jack always told me he found it in a dumpster behind Parsons Street. But then the last time I talked to him, when that was probably 4 or 6 years ago, he included the Ralph Cole thing. So that's,
I mean, we can't get a hold of Ralph Cole, but we suspect it's possible because I've heard that Ralph, who was a guitar player in this band, Lighthouse, this Canadian 10-piece band, played a 58 Flying V and worked at Gibson, and supposedly built his 58 Flying V from 2 pieces he got out of the dumpster. So it's entirely possible he built a Moderne and sold it to your buddy Jack, and it moved on from there. We don't know those parts of the story, and it may be immaterial. It may not matter if it's a fake or, you know, somebody made it or Ralph Cole made it in his high school shop class. We don't know, but it's just interesting to learn the back history of this guitar, which you can find 100 pictures of online, you know, whether it's real, fake, or somewhere in the middle.
Well, the email I got from Ren today, it's sorry, don't remember Ralph Cole. I did play a black Moderne in Bye Bye Birdie at the Barn Theater. After that, I put it back in the company morgue where a lot of older prototypes were kept. Later on, New Orleans folks came and took everything back to Chicago. From there, I have no idea. The original Moderne, everyone is looking for it. Good luck. That's the first time I ever heard that it was black. In anything he was ever quoted, he said he played a Moderne, but he says here that it was black.
And you know, the one that we see is certainly black.
So I put a picture
matches
up. I found out who the star of the play was in 1964, and I found out that he went on to be a famous soap opera guy, and he was in New York City. So I called him and left messages every couple of weeks for about a year, and his wife finally got back to me. I was hoping that his family took a picture of the show of Bye Bye Birdie. There's only one picture of the show, no guitar. She said he doesn't remember the guitar and he has no pictures.
Right. I've got someone in the chat here, and I'm not sure who it is, but it could be Ronald Wood, who wrote the book on the Moderne, who's saying that he talked to Ralph Cole and that Ralph had nothing to do. Oh, it is Ron. Okay. So he said he talked to Ralph Cole. He put together the Flying V. Did he put it together from the dumpster? We don't know that part, but he doesn't have anything to do with the Moderne. So maybe that's just a wild goose chase at that point, throwing that name out there. But it must have come from somewhere, and someone built the thing. We just don't know who it was.
But if you look at the plate that he put on the Flying V, which is cut from an Epiphone Wilshire pickguard, it kind of has the same little round section that the pickguard of the Moderne has, and could have been on the Moderne first, and that's why the routing is behind the stop tail. That round section, it looks like it would fit right on there. So
Right,
maybe
it's hard to say,
it was on
even though
there before the V.
Right, Dan Erlewine is saying he made that pick guard for the Moderne, or actually he didn't say it, but someone said it for him, and so he possibly was the person behind that. Was that you, Eric, who said that he made the pick guard?
Yep.
Yeah, because
He made that guard.
That's something we haven't heard before, is where did this pickguard come from? Because of course it doesn't look anything like the drawings, and no other picture at Gibson had that kind of a pickguard. And that's the one that you see on any Moderne that they claim is original, whether it's the Billy Gibbons, this black one, or even on the copies from Ibanez, they all have that same design. And it's basically Dan just trying to cover up all the damage that was on that guitar, I guess.
They're copying a fake. That's where it all starts.
Yeah. Well, that's the only one that they had was the fake.
No, that's my point. I mean, whatever someone jerry-rigged in the early 70s, that's what they look back on. I mean, Gibson themselves, they had like, I got the Derringer Explorer in 73 or 4 before he had it. And I took pictures, but I never showed anybody pictures of the back of the guitar. And I don't think Derringer did after he got it and totally refinished the guitar and everything. The point is, when Gibson started making the reissue, that guitar had a round toggle plate on the back. Gibson didn't put one on. They also put the Gibson logo on in the wrong place. They copied the guitar after Derringer's was refinished. So even Gibson was knocking off something, you know, taking little pieces of what they saw and putting it on a Gibson guitar that they never did before. So if Gibson's going to do it, anybody else that makes the bottom line is anybody else that's going to make copies is, you know, they're just copying stuff they see and trying to sell it.
Yeah, looks that way. Eric, you have anything else to add? You've been sitting patiently, and I don't know if we've heard everything from you yet.
No, I just was just kind of here to kind of help keep Dan's memory in check a little bit.
Gotcha. I don't. I think we lost Dan at getting his pedicure. But
yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah. I mean, my interest is not even proving is it fake, is it real, is it whatever. I never saw it. Is just where did this thing come from? Who made it? Why did they copy a Gibson Moderne before 1970 when, yes, drawings and things were available, but, you know, it's not the first thing you would think to make a copy of, you know. Who could you really fool with it? Because nobody knew what it was. It's not like you could make a copy and say, I have this, and anybody out there would say, oh, that's worth $1 billion. Nobody even knew what they were. Matter of fact, John called it a Monster V. Dan Erlewine thought it was an Explorer. Like, nobody even knew the name of this thing and what it even might have been. Why would you spend your time copying it? You know?
For the record, I had the patent drawings. I just went and looked them up. In maybe 70, maybe 69. Anybody could have done it. They're in the patent books. I'm just saying, I mean, I was interested in guitars. I started doing it in college and started, you know, buying stuff. And when weird things started appearing, it's like, well, what else are they making? And I just somebody else could have done that. It was really simple.
Yeah, well, sure. It's just an interesting story. That's all. And we all just sit here and grasp at straws and wonder, you know, did they make one, and will one ever show up? And the only thing we have is one that's probably a fake. So.
It's a tough one because we've got John, who knows people in the background there. We've got Mike, who's a legend in the field. We've got George, who's a legend in the field, and we also have Dan, who's a legend in the field. And it's like two people's stories kind of line up, and two other people's stories kind of line up, and unless that thing magically appears and people are allowed to really get their hands on it again, who knows? You know, I trust and respect everybody that I've heard from in this discussion.
Right. And from what most people say when they looked at it, clearly they're, you know, pretty much convinced it didn't come from Gibson. But then the question is, where did it come from, and why did they bother? You know.
But when you look at the little cutout it had for your leg, the same cutout that artist drawing of the Flying V from 1957-58 had, the dark one. So it was like, how did they know that was on that V to put it on the Moderne that they were making to look like what they thought the Moderne looked like?
Well, that's why I think there has to be some involvement with Gibson, even if it's someone pulling something out of a dumpster, or somebody that worked there for a summer job, or somebody who was, you know, there and able to at least see what a real Moderne looked like, or see the plans, or, you know, I don't know that it was just some random person out there. I think somebody had some connection to something to be able to even copy it.
Well, I wish we could get our hands on it.
Yeah. And if they copied it, they certainly would have put the big Gumby headstock on the top of it, you know. And we have to assume it was there at some point. And like John says, it was broken off and replaced or whatever. But if you're going to copy the Moderne, you're of course going to copy what the headstock looked like. And that's not what we see in any of the pictures, you know, of this black guitar, which has a standard. I keep hearing it's a Melody Maker neck. It looks like a Les Paul neck. It's rounded. It's not flat like a Melody Maker neck. So I'm not sure what it is.
I remember an old video where a guy said he heard that after the NAMM show, they had 3 of them, and they did so bad they took them back to the factory and bandsaw them up because they didn't want to look at them.
And that might be what Jack ended up with, was a guitar that had already gone through a bandsaw. It's hard to say. Yeah, I heard that too. They would chop stuff up and throw in the dumpster, and maybe they chopped the top of the headstock off and threw it away. It's hard to say. It was a million years ago, and none of us were there. But hey, thank you so much for your time. I think we've gone probably as far as we can down the rabbit hole of this story, but I appreciate everyone's time, and at least to get a little historical perspective on where this thing might have come from, whose hands it passed through. We don't know where it is now. It hung in the store for years, and now it's vanished again. So maybe it's just
And
in the back.
he brought up Indianapolis. He was hanging in a pawn shop in Indianapolis. There was a woman that I talked to who got an Explorer for her graduation, high school graduation, from a pawn shop in Indianapolis, and that broke, and she went back and got another one, which was one of the 60s Explorers. And she said that pawn shop used to take in a whole lot of Gibson guitars. Whenever Gibson had overruns, or they would just say, "What do you got that we can buy real cheap?" So it could have been there.
Who knows? Maybe someday
It
we'll
wasn't
find
at
out.
Author's Music in Indianapolis, but it could have been at that pawn shop.
Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully someday we'll just be adding to the lore of this mythical guitar, and maybe someday, something will surface, and this will be helpful to somebody. Who knows? Stranger things have happened. Thank you, everybody, for coming on here
Right on.
and spending
Thanks a
time.
lot.
It was certainly cool to see all these people. And
I'm glad you got George. I kind of told you he was up for anything.
that was worth the price of admission for just seeing those
Yeah,
snakes.
that was awesome.
Between
He was
George's
great.
snakes and Dan's pedicure, I'm happy. I don't want any more than that. So
Thanks, guys.
thank you, everybody, so
Pleasure.
much. I really appreciate it.
Everybody.
Take
Pleasure
care.
chatting with you guys.
See you.